That report from Margot O'Neill.
10th parliamentary leader.
I'd like to thank my predecessor, John Hewson, for all he has done over the last 4 years.
I intend to fight on for what I believe in, and I intend to do that by giving Alexander Down and his new team my 100% support and loyalty.
Despite the rhetoric of unity, the defeated leader was soon sacked from the shadow cabinet.
I have played it straight.
John Hewson has been a member of the team, but he has not played the team game.
My message to Mr Downer is very clear. Mr Downer, you will not heal the wounds of the Liberal Party by turning the knife.
The issue of loyalty plagues the Liberals. The last time the Federal Party managed an entirely happy leadership change was when Robert Menzies handed over to his deputy, Harold Holt, back in 1966.
I confidently believe that our best years are ahead of us, and not behind us, proud though we may be.
But the years ahead would be complicated by war in Vietnam.
That you have an admiring friend, a staunch friend, that will be all the way with LBJ.
The Federal Liberal Party became accident-prone. One leader was lost, another destroyed by chronic infighting. Finally, the party cascaded to electoral defeat, as the habits of disunity were learnt.
Critics of the stomp say it is weird, undignified, more like a corrobboree than a conventional dance. And the stomp is in trouble. At least 2 municipal councils, one in Sydney, the other in South Australia, have put their foot down.
The Menzies post-war years had delivered national prosperity and a self-confident Liberal government. Late in '66, the party went to the polls, fighting the election over the Vietnam involvement.
The Australian... He can't possibly talk again. I'm indebted to a gentleman here this morning who informs me he was talking to a young lass whose brother was killed in Vietnam. The vital issues which affect the future security of this country. The Right Honourable Harold Holt.
It was the Liberals' biggest ever win. Harold Holt won a 41-seat majority. Yet even in his time of triumph, the Prime Minister felt the heat of his new job.
Harold didn't like the idea of young Australians going to war. The whole thing was just so against his nature. But nevertheless, he believed it was right, and therefore believed that it was his duty as Prime Minister to defend that sort of decision. And I think it took a great deal out of him, probably.
He was a decent man, and that inspired people to go after him and to follow him and to do what he wanted. That's why I feel angry at the unspeakable bastards who were plotting his defeat at the time of his death. They've got a lot to answer for, those people.
Holt's massive majority hid flaws in the Liberal fabric. It had taken a Menzies to manage some of the personalities in the coalition. Deputy Liberal leader William McMahon, for one, was a man who made friends and enemies. His great friend and supporter was Frank Packer, owner of the Sydney Telegraph.
I think that our press, that I'm talking about the Telegraph in those days, exerted a tremendous political influence. And of course, our views were very strictly conservative.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. McEwen.
McMahon's enemy was Deputy Prime Minister John McEwen, leader of the Country Party.
Thank you, Mr. Tunney.
They're a bit like
water and oil. They just didn't mix very well. But I think over a period of time, McMahon probably told stories to the media with a slant that annoyed John McEwen. I think that's where the dislike developed.
Then there were the younger men with ambition. Malcolm Fraser had spent 10 years on the backbench under Menzies.
I said to Harold at the time, no sour grapes, but I don't want to be a private member of Parliament all my life. And if the leader of the party is not going to regard me as ministerial material at some stage, I'll be very happy to step down and make way in Monaghan for somebody else who may be ministerial material.
I don't know how ambitious Malcolm was for himself at that time, but he revealed very strong ambitions later on, so I must assume they didn't just suddenly come to him.
Harold Holt duly made Malcolm Fraser Army Minister. Fraser served next to other Liberal prospects, Billy Snedden, Don Chipp, and 27-year-old Andrew Peacock. The sea-loving Harold Holt began to look quite different from Menzies, and the party began to find a new course.
We are going, we are going, we are going to freedom.
We want to become a part of our country.
In 1967, the government ended constitutional discrimination against Aborigines, backing a national referendum. Racism was also addressed when Holt finished off the White Australia immigration policy. But Holt had his problems.
The Voyager and the aircraft carrier were performing a manoeuvre known as turning together. A Royal Commission later found that unaccountably the destroyer had made a tighter turn than ordered.
The drama of the Voyager accident was still running, with questions about secrecy, compensation, and a second Royal Commission. By 1967, there was also a growing controversy about the use of government VIP planes.
Harold Holt's grip on the game seemed to be loosening. I will never forget a moment in the House when Harold produced a letter supporting what the government was doing. And he read the letter, took him about a minute to read the letter, and finally Whitlam interjected, I think it was Whitlam, and said, "Who signed it?" And there's tense silence in the House. And Harold said, "It's not signed." Now, I don't think I've ever experienced a moment in the House of Representatives like there was in that next few seconds. Our troops were just aghast. There was uproar on the Labor benches. Now, it was a silly thing to do, but that wasn't the point. The point was that we knew we had a leader who would do something quite stupid.
He was being undermined all the time by McMahon, who was working around amongst members to try and get rid of him. Oh, yes, didn't you know that?
I last saw Harold Holt in Canberra, talked to him, and I remember his words saying, Len, man wasn't made to live like this.
At the end of 1967, Holt retreated for the weekend to Portsea. He carried a letter from the party whip, which expressed concern over the government's performance.
My own feeling about what happened is something like this. He was a very good swimmer, a very good snorkeler, and he came back to Melbourne and troubled, not very well, overstretched, overstrained, worried, I believe, at the ascendancy which Whitlam was beginning to gain, and thinking, well, now I can relax. There's one area in which I really am unchallenged boss, and that's the sea. And I think in that sort of frame of mind, he went to the element where he felt liberated and misjudged the kindness with which his favourite element would receive him on that fatal day.
The search today was hampered by rain, strong winds and vicious seas. Since early this morning, the weather has been completely factor of this whole tragedy is that due to the fact that no trace has been found of Mr. Holt, world leaders who are anxious to pay tribute to the Australian Prime Minister feel it injudicious to do so while...
One senior Liberal cried over the phone, said, "Chippy, I don't think I can ever get over this." Another one expressed concern that I'd loved this man ever since I was a boy. And I was so naive at the time, I thought their concern, their grief was genuine. But of course, in politics, it's such a hideous game that as soon as one leader dies, there's not grief or sympathy that is evoked in the breasts of many. It is suddenly a wish to be leader. The thought that, well, I can take his place. Now, these people were ringing me not to express their grief, but it was to sound me out about their chances and how they'd operate as a candidate.
First, I want now publicly to express through your media my deep regret at the loss of Mr. Holt.
John McEwen was sworn in as Prime Minister, but as Country Party leader, he could not hold the office permanently. However, he had a blunt message for the Liberals.
But I have told Mr. McMahon that neither I nor my Country Party colleagues would be prepared to serve under him as Prime Minister.
He didn't trust him, and he might as well settle the issue once and for all. And so he just said that he would not work under McMahon.
McMahon was completely obsessed with and incensed with what had happened. He just couldn't believe it. But the answer was the party believes John McEwen when he said this, and there's not much you can do about it.
This left the field open. Paul Hasluck was persuaded to stand by old hands, including Menzies. The second main candidate was Senate leader John Gorton. Harold Holt's body was never found. The positioning for the inheritance went on over several days.
At Harold Holt's memorial service, there was as much talk and lobbying for leadership positions at that as there were tributes being paid, and that was sickening. It was one of the most sickening public services I've ever been to.
His term of office as Prime Minister has been all too short. It is impossible for us to calculate now what the loss of Mr. Holt will mean to Australia at this juncture in our history.
There was some lobbying going on because I was doing some.
An organised corps lobbied hard for Gorton, amongst them Junior Minister Malcolm Fraser.
I did much less, I think, in that contest than I was sometimes, than some people sometimes suggested. But I did vote for John Gorton.
Malcolm was genuinely very strong. Well, Malcolm was very strong for Gorton, and I have no recall of anything other than Malcolm believing that John Gorton would make an excellent Prime Minister.
John Gorton, however, had enemies. Victorian Liberal Premier of 12 years, Henry Bolte, fired the first shots in a long campaign of state Liberals against Gorton.
Well, it was the Sunday that Harold Holt went missing. The Boltes were coming to lunch the next day. Henry had obviously had several whiskies on the way, and we had to have the television on all the time. He looked at the television, he used the telephone, he then had a drink, He then went into the pool, and we were afraid he might drown because we've always been told you shouldn't swim if you've had a lot to drink. But he was so livid because he had phone calls on the Sunday night that Gorton was going to get up as the leader. And I think that dislike of Gorton continued all his life.
The Liberal Party took only 20 minutes to vote in Senator Gorton as the new leader.
A fighter pilot whose face had been reconstructed after a wartime accident, Gorton set off a swell of popular support. He had a casual charm and a touch of the larrikin. He was a very different Liberal from Menzies.
Don't forget, Menzies was born in the 1800s or something, and he'd been going up with the King and the Queen. He didn't have a feeling so much for an Australian nation. And I did have a feeling of Australia as a nation.
He was calling forth a national spirit in people that the pockets of parochialism in Australia find hard to accept.
Of course, these new ideas didn't go down well with the troglodytes in the party, the arch-conservatives.
Well, look, first of all, I belong to a Liberal party, not a Conservative party.
But in truth, a Conservative party.
Well, I think it's a Liberal party. At any rate, I'm a Liberal. And
I began to have significant reservations about John Gorton as Prime Minister, almost as soon as he became Prime Minister. Some of John Gorton's early interviews, I think, made the point that if he felt strongly enough about an issue, he ought to be able to get his own way, regardless of what his cabinet felt. That made me uneasy.
Gorton was an economic interventionist who favoured schemes like industry development. He clashed with the more free market approach of McMahon and Treasury.
I tried to get the Liberal Party to take new approaches in the fields of social services and Commonwealth-state relations and overseas investment, retaining Australian equity and Australian ownership of assets and things of that kind. All these raised some kind of opposition from somewhere and caused some controversy all the time.
By the end of 1969, Conservative premiers like Robert Askin of New South Wales ruled in every state. But national unity eluded John Gorton. Above all, Vietnam split the community. Even the Prime Minister himself had no great enthusiasm for the war.
In fact, I thought it was a nuisance, really. But we were engaged in it. It was strongly held by the Liberal Party that we should be in it, and I wasn't going to say, well, we shouldn't be in it.
Gorton's lukewarm commitment pleased no one, least of all Conservatives who wanted a more hawkish defence policy.
One of the biggest arguments I had with Gorton was in 1969, where it was essential that we have the DLP preferences. And after discussions with the DLP, they were very concerned in regard to the defence of Australia. And they particularly wanted a naval base at Coburn Sound in Western Australia, which many of us wanted. It was terribly important that something of that nature was done. And I spoke to Gorton about it, and he said, oh no, forget it. He said, I don't want to have to do anything like that. So I told him straight out, I said, okay, well, you lose the election. You either do that, or you're not going to get DLP preferences. And fortunately, he agreed to do it.
With the country split over defence and conscription, John Gorton went to the polls. His majority was reduced from 38 to 7.
There is some dissatisfaction. It is shown by the vote, and it is necessary for that to be identified and rectified.
Within days, a cabinet minister resigned and Gorton was challenged for the leadership by William McMahon.
Yes. Gentlemen, I can advise you that on the first ballot, the Prime Minister, John Gorton, has been elected leader of the Liberal Party.
Well, I can only say that I am not of or in the establishment.
So your policies probably will not change, you don't feel?
Oh, I think they might, but I think, as I've indicated, they would need to. But I think it's unlikely that they would change in a conservative direction.
John Gorton has been elected the leader of the Liberal Party. We in the party have given our unqualified allegiance to him as the leader. And there are no divisions in our party itself.
To the dismay of supporters like Frank Packer, McMahon was demoted from Treasury.
I couldn't describe Bill McMahon's role in Gorton's downfall in any coherent, connected, analytical fashion, because that's not the way Bill McMahon worked. It was rather hole in corner. It was a smile here and a nod there and a wink there. But he was a very, very destructive politician so far as the stability of the leadership went.
As I moved in business circles in Sydney, I'd be asked questions. Wasn't Gorton financially unsound? Thoughts that had been planted in the business community by Billy.
Gorton's battle with the Conservatives only intensified. He signalled that he wanted to take the states to the High Court over ownership of Australia's offshore seabed.
It has been referred to as an attempt to take the benefits of mineral deposits on the seabed away from the states. It isn't. It's been described as an attempt to take away states' legal rights. It isn't. It is purely and simply an attempt to discover, by the only means known to me, who is legally responsible for the control of the seas around Australia. We are the only nation which does not know what the legal position is and where sovereignty lies. And it can surely not be claimed to be an act of centralism to seek to discover this.
The fabric of the Liberal Party had been challenged, and the question of the federal nature of the party, because John Gorton had demonstrated that he'd become a most centralist Prime Minister, or certainly a very centralist Prime Minister for a Liberal.
Gorton was a man